Riley James hadn't moved to Oak Ridge for the community or the scenery. He'd had enough of scenic views and neighborly smiles in his previous life. What he wanted now was simple: silence, predictability, structure. After nearly 15 years of working in high-risk environments, analyzing the causes of catastrophic battery failures, some of them fatal, he needed out. Not because he couldn't handle the pressure, but because the politics, the manipulation of truth for convenience, the intentional mislabeling of fire patterns in electric vehicle accidents to avoid liability, all of it had worn him thin. So when his consulting contract with an international risk assessment firm came to a close, he didn't renew. Instead, he took his exit quietly, sold his apartment near the bay, and purchased a modern, low-profile townhome in what the realtors called a vehicular-neutral development, a phrase that both intrigued and annoyed him. The community, if it could be called that, was marketed as a haven for progressive living. Wide pedestrian lanes, mandated solar installations, mandatory composting, and minimal street parking. Cars weren't banned, but they were clearly unwelcome, treated like a tolerated vice rather than a modern necessity. Riley didn't care. He didn't move there to impress anyone or participate in ideological debates about sustainability. He chose the place because it was quiet, had good security infrastructure, and offered enough distance from the kind of people who'd spent the last decade dragging their feet on real safety reforms while using data like wallpaper. Nice to look at, but easy to peel away when inconvenient. And besides, Riley didn't drive just any car. His new Tesla Model Y wasn't a symbol of luxury or trend following. It was a tool, a vehicle he trusted because he had dissected hundreds like it, sometimes in scorched pieces, sometimes intact, and knew their tolerances better than most engineers who designed them. His Tesla had custom firmware, a cooling loop override he'd written himself, and a fire detection subroutine that could isolate thermal anomalies 3 seconds faster than the stock software. It was not a toy. It was a statement. I know what I'm doing. He moved in early March during a week of unseasonably warm weather. The welcome packet he received was thick with documents, most of which he discarded after scanning. He didn't plan to use the community garden or participate in the block-wide composting challenge. He installed his own fast-charging wall unit, approved in the blueprints, and kept to himself. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to notice that Riley James didn't attend Thursday walk socials or decorate his porch with rotating seasonal flair. He nodded politely when walking his dog and avoided unnecessary conversations, and for a while that worked. The first real incident came 10 days after he moved in. Riley found a note taped to the side of his power cabinet in loopy cursive. It read, "Please be mindful of battery fumes. This is a clean air zone." No signature, no real meaning, just a passive-aggressive shot across the bow. He read it twice, shrugged, and tossed it in the recycling bin. That weekend, while checking the thermal integrity of his charger during an unusually hot afternoon, he noticed a fine scratch across the rear panel of the Tesla. At first, he assumed it was debris from landscaping, small gravel thrown by wind or a careless blower. But the arc of the scratch was too deliberate, too smooth. Not an accident. He didn't say anything, didn't install cameras. He simply logged it, took a picture for himself, and recalibrated his proximity alert sensors. By week 3, someone had keyed "fire cleanses fakes" into the rear quarter panel. That night, he removed the paint with a controlled heat treatment and buffed the metal until the letters were nearly invisible. He didn't report it. Instead, he ordered a motion-triggered thermal sensor and integrated it into his home system. The person behind these acts clearly wanted a reaction. Riley wouldn't give them one. That was his rule, always had been. Keep the pressure low, observe, and act only when the outcome is already decided. But internally, something had shifted. This wasn't annoyance anymore, it was encroachment. It was ritualistic, almost symbolic, a kind of purification fantasy against something unwelcome. And there was one resident who seemed to embody that exact energy. Karen Mallory lived directly across from Riley. She was somewhere in her late 60s, with neatly combed gray hair, a floral scarf perpetually tied around her neck like it was part of her skin, and a voice that managed to carry across the street even in a whisper. From day one, she had made it her mission to initiate Riley into the spirit of Oak Ridge, which apparently involved various invasive expectations, On the day he moved in, she brought a mason jar of herbal water and introduced herself as the block representative for Energy Harmony. Riley had accepted the jar, said thank you, and never opened it. She had made comments, offhanded, always smiling, about how electric cars were just a different flavor of pollution, and how her nephew's hybrid burned their whole garage down last year. He didn't engage. She started leaving flyers on his doorstep about community-sponsored bike co-ops and decarbonized lifestyle audits. When he installed his charger, she watched from across the street with arms folded, occasionally taking notes. One morning, she stepped into the road as Riley pulled in from a short drive. She raised her hand like a traffic cop, and Riley, more out of curiosity than respect, stopped and rolled down the window. She leaned in slightly, smiled. You know, some of us moved here for the air, the silence, the lack of hum. Riley blinked. The car's silent. But the presence isn't, she replied cryptically, tapping the side of the Tesla. Some things don't belong here, Mr. James, even if they're quiet. That night, Riley updated the firmware on his charging unit to include a fail-safe sensor bypass in case someone tried to tamper with the system. The threat wasn't technical, it was ideological, and ideology didn't care about evidence or systems. It only wanted compliance. By the end of his first month, Riley had documented 3 minor acts of vandalism, 5 unsolicited pamphlets, 2 vague threats, and a recorded audio clip from his thermal sensor where someone, female, likely Karen, whispered the word poison while passing by. Still, he said nothing. No police reports, no neighborhood complaints. But he changed the timing on his vehicle diagnostics so that his car would always be active in the early morning hours, emitting faint system tones, a signal, perhaps, that he was aware, that he was watching too. What he didn't anticipate was the escalation, or how far it would go before anyone else realized what kind of sickness had taken root beneath their pretty solar panels and eco-slogans. Because in Oak Ridge, nothing was quite what it seemed. The clean streets, the curated flower beds, the warm LED lights under every eave, these were just optics. Beneath that lay a creeping hostility toward outsiders, toward systems not invented there, and most of all toward people who didn't ask for permission to exist on their terms. When the fire finally came, Riley wasn't surprised. He had known it was coming for days, maybe weeks. What surprised him wasn't the act, but the precision, the unmistakable mark of someone who thought they understood how these cars burned, someone who thought they'd watched enough news clips to recreate a battery fire and make it look like an accident, someone who never imagined that the man behind the wheel was one of the few people who could look at the blackened remains and read them like a confession. Because Karen hadn't just picked the wrong neighbor. She'd picked the only person who knew exactly what a real EV fire looked like, and what it didn't. The fire didn't arrive with chaos. It began with a subtle shift, an atmospheric pressure in the air that Riley couldn't quite place, a feeling that something had moved out of its natural order. He wasn't guided by alarms or sirens, nor did the situation escalate with the drama people often expect. What struck him first was the smell, not sharp or smoky, but thick and synthetic, carrying the acidic trace of chemical ignition. He moved quickly but without panic, opening the window just enough to confirm what instinct had already told him. Below, at the edge of his driveway, flames had consumed his Tesla. They curled upward in rhythmic, almost elegant bursts, controlled in a way that betrayed the illusion of spontaneity. He'd seen hundreds of electric vehicle fires over the years, accidents, malfunctions, rare but explainable anomalies, and this wasn't one of them. This was too focused, too efficient. The damage originated around the charge port, blossomed outward in a clean arc, and continued without erratic flare or spread. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to start. He stepped into his boots, grabbed the extinguisher from the utility shelf, and moved around the perimeter with practiced precision. Not to stop the fire. It was well past that point. But to prevent damage from spreading to the garage structure. The vehicle hissed and snapped, the sound of polymers liquefying and battery enclosures buckling under heat. He deployed suppressant foam along the edge of the hedge and across the exposed soil, forming a containment border rather than wasting resources on the already lost car. Smoke pulsed upward in thick spirals. By the time emergency crews arrived, the vehicle was reduced to a blackened shell, unrecognizable except for the remnants of its alloy wheels and the bent frame that once held the battery module. One of the responders approached him, clipboard in hand, expression neutral but alert. Were you around when it started? The man asked, scanning the surroundings with practiced detachment. I was here, Riley replied. He kept his posture still, his tone even. No alarms, no movement. I noticed the fire just after it had taken hold. Any idea what caused it? The question came fast, too early to be sincere. Too early to say, Riley answered. He knew how this worked. The official narrative would take time to form, and he wasn't interested in interfering with that process. He didn't need to press his assumptions. All he had to do was watch. The report would use vague phrases. Possible electrical fault, potential energy accumulation, isolated incident. That was the pattern. But Riley already suspected something else, something less convenient. He made no dramatic declarations, no accusations. He contacted his insurance provider, initiated a full asset loss claim, and flagged the event as an anomaly in his internal vehicle tracking system. The Tesla's custom telemetry software, designed and modified by Riley himself, had already uploaded segmented diagnostic logs to an encrypted cloud server. The data was intact. More importantly, it showed a thermal progression incompatible with spontaneous failure. The heat profile climbed in discrete pulses rather than a single exponential curve. That indicated staged ignition, likely applied externally and carefully timed. While the burned wreck was still cooling, Riley reviewed footage from his property's monitoring system. Strangely, the cameras had gone offline. Not permanently, just long enough. They rebooted minutes after the fire had fully engaged. It wasn't coincidence. The disruption was intentional and precisely executed, likely using a localized signal blocker that didn't trip broader alerts. That type of interference wasn't common. It required knowledge, equipment, and intent. A rushed prank wouldn't have that level of sophistication. He checked the yard, noting depressions in the soil near the southern edge. Thin, narrow tracks that suggested wheels. Not car wheels, equipment, possibly a handcart. The pattern led toward the driveway, but veered off just before the point of ignition. A clean path in, a clean path out. No visible debris, no discarded items. Whoever entered did so quietly, efficiently, and left without panic. Riley documented the impressions and marked the coordinates. An independent fire inspector arrived for the post-incident analysis. Riley observed him work without comment, respecting the boundary between his former field and this man's current one. The inspector circled the wreck, paused near the left rear panel, and crouched. That's interesting, he said, gesturing toward the exposed chassis. No explosion pattern. The battery pack collapsed inward instead of projecting outward. Riley said nothing. Usually, the inspector continued, you'd expect uneven pressure, some directional bias from the initial failure. But this looks like it cooked deliberately, like it was walked into. That wasn't an official conclusion. It was an invitation. Could be unusual chemistry, or exposure to a focused accelerant, the man added. Riley responded only with a short nod. He offered no alternative theories. He didn't need to. Later, alone again, he reviewed the vehicle's logs. The system had registered 3 rapid thermal spikes, each within 10 seconds of the last. Not gradual escalation, not overcurrent. 3 separate ignition triggers, staggered and deliberate. No internal fault could replicate that pattern. Riley knew it, and so would anyone else qualified to read the telemetry. This wasn't just a fire. It was a message, and not just from a disgruntled neighbor trying to make a point. This was someone playing with fire in both the literal and technical sense. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't march across the street or make a scene. He filed the report. He forwarded the logs to a former colleague now working with a battery materials consultancy. He uploaded anonymized data into a private research forum known for tracking incidents of potential sabotage. Not for attention, for comparison. For the slow accumulation of pressure that would eventually force recognition. He submitted a formal request to his homeowner's insurance carrier to keep the physical shell of the Tesla untouched for a third-party examination. He wasn't hunting for justice. He was curating evidence. The next day, an envelope was placed inside his mailbox with no postage. Inside was a typed note that read, Electricity invites judgment. Some things should stay off-grid. No name. No fingerprints. Nothing that could be traced easily. Just like the fire itself, deliberate, antiseptic, quietly violent. Riley read the note once, then shredded it without reaction. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. What he felt was recognition. The lines had been drawn, but not between personalities. This was no neighborhood feud. This was ideology versus reality. And someone had decided that his car, his presence, his refusal to fold into their illusion of purity was a threat. They had set the fire expecting to break his sense of control. Instead, they activated it. The scent of burnt polymer had barely faded from the air when the next phase began, and this time it wasn't subtle. It came not as a whisper or threat scrawled in handwriting or smoke, but as policy, impersonal, bureaucratic, and far more suffocating than fire. Riley received a letter in his mailbox, formatted with neutral margins and printed on heavy off-white paper. The language was as polished as it was condescending. It stated, without invitation for rebuttal, that recent events had raised concerns about infrastructure compliance and energy regulation safety thresholds within the community. The phrase residents with high-energy equipment installations was underlined in bold, and although no names were mentioned, the implication was as direct as a blow to the head. Attached was a request, framed as a precautionary audit, for access to inspect his home's electrical system, his charging unit, and any modifications made to energy-related fixtures. Riley didn't respond immediately. He read the letter twice, placed it on the counter, and let it sit there untouched for the rest of the day. He knew what this was. It wasn't about safety. It was a provocation wearing the mask of procedure, a pressure tactic meant to shake loose any semblance of privacy or control he still held over his property. When he did respond, he didn't argue. He submitted a formal letter requesting clarification on the legal basis for the audit, citing building codes, state statutes, and private property rights. He included documentation of his permit for the charger, installation blueprints, and the municipal approval date, all stamped, official, and unambiguous. His tone was neutral, clinical, professional, but the message was clear. He wasn't just a resident, and he wasn't afraid of paperwork. Days passed without a response. Then, without warning, the power in his garage was disconnected. The breaker hadn't tripped, and no outage was reported on the utility map. Riley traced the issue to a severed connection on the exterior line, clean, deliberate, and tampered with behind the locked access panel. That panel was supposed to be sealed. It was only accessible by certified technicians or someone with the master code, something he had changed when he moved in. The only people with override access were regional inspectors or contractors licensed through the county. Yet there it was. The lock removed, the seal broken, the line cut. He filed a complaint through the utility provider's formal system. 3 days later, a representative called and informed him that the disconnection was part of a compliance-driven system review prompted by local coordination. No further details were available. Riley didn't protest. He logged the call, recorded the audio, and scheduled a private contractor to restore the line under emergency status, which he paid for out of pocket. It was the first time in years he'd felt himself entering that mode again. The quiet, calculated state he used to inhabit during failure chain analysis, when assumptions could cost lives and second-guessing wasn't allowed. It wasn't anger he felt. It was precision. He rebuilt the connection with fortified shielding and installed an inline sensor that would notify him if the power draw changed by even a fraction. That wasn't paranoia. That was logic. The neighbors began to shift after that. Not overtly, not with confrontation, but with subtle realignments. Conversations stopped when he passed. Joggers no longer nodded as they passed his sidewalk. Trash bins moved a few feet closer to his property line and were left open after collection. Someone poured a trail of gray mulch across his driveway during the night, an act so nonsensical in its execution that it had to be symbolic, some passive ritual of rejection masquerading as landscaping. He swept it up without comment. In a community where civility was weaponized, silence was the only counterstrike. The worst came a week after the fire, when Riley received a second envelope, this time not from a nameless board or utility, but signed by Karen herself. Typed, notarized, and delivered by hand to his door. The letter accused him of endangering public health by introducing unstable energy devices to a residential environment and requested a community hearing to evaluate the status of his integration into the neighborhood ecosystem. The language was polished, full of jargon that disguised its underlying message. "You are not welcome here." It was a maneuver, not personal, but strategic. She wasn't trying to punish him. She was trying to remove him surgically, legally, and with community consent. That was the real danger. Not the fire, not even the vandalism. It was the normalization of exclusion under the guise of safety. Riley didn't attend the hearing. He didn't need to. Instead, he sent a letter through his attorney, a civil rights specialist he had on retainer for corporate consultation, now redirected to something far more personal. The letter outlined his legal rights, his compliance with all municipal and state guidelines, and noted that any further attempts to restrict his access to energy or modify his property without consent would result in a formal lawsuit. He didn't bluff. He attached the relevant case law complete with citations and precedents and sent a copy to the county clerk. The hearing still happened, of course. Neighbors gathered in the central pavilion, sipping flavored water and making statements into the record. Some expressed concern, others just nodded along. Karen, by all reports, gave a rousing plea for community cohesion. No action was taken, but the lines had been drawn. That evening, as Riley sat on his back patio, one of the few places still untouched by intrusion, he received an alert on his motion sensor log. A heat bloom had been detected near the base of his restored power unit. He checked the camera feed. Nothing visible. He reviewed the thermal imaging overlay. A faint pulse. Something small. Organic. Maybe animal, maybe not. He rose from his chair, not in a rush, but with the certainty that he needed to confirm what he already suspected. At the base of the panel, he found what at first looked like spilled soil, but as he crouched and examined it, he realized it was a cluster of seeds, all identical, wrapped in a damp cloth, half-buried, the type of seed used in controlled botanical decay studies, often experimental, sometimes invasive. Not something someone drops casually. This was left, not lost. It wasn't fire this time, it was infiltration, a test to see if something could take root where it didn't belong. Riley gathered the cloth, sealed it in a specimen bag, and placed it in the containment case he kept for materials transport. He didn't know yet if it was toxic, symbolic, or just mischief, but he knew it wasn't accidental. He sent a query to a university lab under a colleague's name, asking for an identification match. No context, no commentary, just data. He spent the rest of the evening reinforcing the exterior boundary with acoustic sensors and setting up an independent air quality monitor. The battle had moved below the surface, into soil, into whispers, into the realm of things not easily proven but deeply understood. He didn't feel threatened. He felt clarity. The escalation had arrived, and with it, a shift in the landscape. There would be no direct confrontation. Not yet. The people pushing him weren't interested in debate. They wanted permission to erase, not argue. But Riley had spent too many years understanding systems to let one devour him from within. They had tried to break his silence with fire. Now they were trying to wear him down with process. What they didn't know, what Karen didn't understand, was that Riley James had never been most dangerous when provoked. He was dangerous when patient. Riley didn't treat the escalation as an emergency, nor did he romanticize it into a battle. What he did instead was engage the way a seasoned professional engages a puzzle, with unspoken certainty that the pieces would eventually fit together, and that any attempt to force a pattern before all evidence had surfaced would result in distortion, not clarity. He began by assembling a file, not a frantic collage of accusations and guesses, but a structured archive of every incident, change, anomaly, and response logged since the day he arrived in Oak Ridge. Every letter, every power fluctuation, every chemical trace left behind after the fire, every piece of footage, even the seed cluster which came back identified as a non-native, root-aggressive species typically used to overwhelm shallow root. Vegetation, legal in some states, restricted in others. Individually, these incidents meant little. Together, they hinted at something systemic. Rather than chase the ghost of intention, Riley focused on data paths, He used a secondary access portal to retrieve copies of communications between regional inspection services and property audits. As a certified consultant still technically active in several professional networks, he knew where such communications were archived, how long they were retained, and what internal keywords could trigger inspection workflows. Within one such archive, he found an internal requisition request for an energy risk evaluation, submitted under community proxy, flagged urgent, and carrying the anonymized digital signature of a private risk partner. It had been filed 2 weeks before his vehicle fire. The language mirrored the audit notices he'd received, nearly word for word. The signature wasn't public, but Riley recognized the formatting convention. It belonged to a specific vendor group, one he'd had experience with in Nevada during a cluster of suspicious insurance claims involving early-generation hybrids. He didn't dig further himself. Instead, he contacted a former colleague who had transitioned from field analysis to corporate forensics, a man named Derek who worked under NDAs for half the insurance carriers on the West Coast. Riley sent him only metadata and a blind excerpt. No names, no direct context, just enough to trace origin and usage. A few days later, Derek called him, his tone quieter than usual, sharper, like someone choosing words with surgical care. "The vendor tag you sent, I've seen that one. They're tied to a batch of policy buyouts that got buried last year. Someone's laundering evaluations through community committees to trigger early payouts on renewable asset risk portfolios. Mostly solar installs, battery walls, that sort of thing. But lately they've been pushing into mobile EVs. You're not the first I've seen flagged." Riley didn't speak at first. He absorbed the information the way a machine absorbs voltage, steady and unshaken. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "How close to us?" There was a pause. Derek exhaled through his nose. "Close enough I'd check your insurer's claim history. And if you're still holding the wreck, don't let anyone move it. That signature, it shows up after the fire, not before. They don't start the damage, they finish it." After ending the call, Riley sat for a while, not to think but to observe. The quiet around him was the same as always, but now it carried weight. The fire hadn't been about fear. It had been about value extraction. A destroyed EV in a documented fire zone could trigger significant underwriting shifts, especially if the unit had custom modifications, especially if those modifications were never declared in a formal warranty registration. And Riley's Tesla had been unique, not in branding, but in infrastructure. His installation had been too independent, too self-contained, too efficient to be passive, and someone had realized it could be exploited, not by reselling it, but by framing it as an uncontrolled hazard, something uninsurable, something that made every similar unit in the area more expensive to cover. He now understood Karen's real position. She wasn't just a zealot trying to preserve the eco-spirit of the neighborhood. She was an amplifier. Whether knowingly or not, she was echoing the kind of language that legitimized commercial action, building fear, establishing narrative, creating a framework where interference looked like responsibility. Her letters, her complaints, her staging of a community hearing, they all served a dual function. They created local tension, yes, but they also established documentation, a visible trail of escalating public concern. And once that trail existed, it could be harvested by third-party interests, who could then claim they were merely responding to risk, not initiating it. With that clarity came resolve. Riley didn't rush to call out names or escalate the conflict through direct confrontation. He instead contacted a neutral third-party electrical engineer and hired them to conduct a safety audit of his entire energy system. Not in defense, but as preemptive certification. When the audit came back clean, he filed the results with the city registry and attached it to his property file, locking down any future attempts to question his compliance without substantial new evidence. He installed a secondary firewall on his home network, segmented his system, and rerouted his sensor logs to an off-site server. This wasn't paranoia, it was containment. That week, he received an envelope marked Community Access Notification. It was unsigned but contained a notice stating that, due to his failure to participate in collective energy alignment discussions, he was being flagged as potentially non-collaborative under the Community Energy Neutrality Agreement. No such agreement existed in legal terms, but the language was designed to resemble an ordinance. He made 3 copies, forwarded one to his attorney, another to a journalist friend who specialized in local policy fraud, and archived the third. He didn't reply. The moment that shifted everything, the true midpoint, came not in paperwork, not in sabotage, but in an unexpected act of support. A resident 2 blocks down, someone he had never spoken to, approached him during what looked like a routine walk. No greeting. Just a statement, low and fast, without eye contact. They asked me to file a complaint against you. Said I'd get reimbursed for landscape repairs. I didn't do it. You should know they've done this before. Different target, same method. Before Riley could respond, the man had already continued walking. No name was exchanged, but that single moment confirmed what Riley had only suspected until then, that the attacks weren't isolated. They were part of a larger operation, one that relied on compliance, on silence, on participation masked as consensus. It wasn't just Karen. It was a machine that fed on passive cooperation. From that moment forward, Riley no longer treated the situation as personal. He treated it as systemic, which meant inevitably it was solvable. The silence following the midpoint wasn't peace. It was restraint. The type of calculated pause that comes when a system is reloading, when the actors behind a facade recalibrate their approach. Riley expected it. He'd spent too long watching organizations wrap their real motivations in the language of concern to think the pushback had ended. If anything, he knew the reprieve only meant something more invasive was coming, something that would abandon pretense in favor of overt action masked in legal formality. And it came exactly like that, without subtlety, without grace, and with such procedural efficiency that Riley could almost appreciate the elegance of the maneuver if it weren't aimed at undermining the integrity of everything he'd worked to secure. It began with a formal notice, this time not anonymous, not from Karen, but from the local zoning office, citing a newly filed claim alleging that Riley's home modifications, specifically the power distribution system tied to his charging unit, violated updated urban utility codes. The phrasing was careful, bureaucratically precise, and vaguely threatening. Unregistered load management devices detected. No fine, not yet, just an invitation for corrective inspection, a phrase that in practical terms meant they were planning to enter his home under the guise of technical verification. Riley had read enough into their pattern to know this wasn't a city-initiated action. It was coordinated. The only way such a review would be prompted was through an official referral, which meant someone had submitted a report, likely built on the same misinformation Karen had seeded in the community. Someone had converted rumor into paperwork. Riley's response was measured but absolute. He submitted a written denial of entry, citing his rights under state and municipal statutes, attaching a copy of his independent electrical audit along with the credentials of the third-party engineer who had performed the inspection. He didn't ask for reconsideration. He simply stated the facts and reminded the office that any forced entry or unilateral action without judicial order would constitute a violation of property rights. The response was immediate. The zoning office deferred to community-based compliance oversight, effectively washing their hands of further involvement. It was a coordinated retreat, one that signaled escalation from institutional to strategic harassment. They had failed to enter through the city, so now they would come through the neighborhood itself. The following week, flyers appeared, professional in print, with polished layout and vague eco-themed imagery. They circulated through doorsteps and mailboxes, describing an initiative for cleaner urban spaces, warning of invisible dangers caused by off-grid systems, and listing signs that residents should look for. High output panels, unusually quiet. Equipment, unregistered antennas, foreign inverter modules. No names were mentioned, but Riley's house matched every descriptor. It was an invitation to fear, wrapped in design language that pretended to care about harmony. The message was simple. Surveillance was civic duty. If you see something efficient, say something. It would have been laughable if not for how effective it became. Within days, Riley's home became a boundary, not in property lines but in behavior. Children who used to pass by on bikes now steered clear of his sidewalk. Delivery drivers left packages further away from his porch, as though proximity could trigger something volatile. Several neighbors installed new motion lights pointed directly at his driveway. Someone filed a landscaping complaint against him for unsanctioned drought-adverse flora, even though his lawn was synthetic and approved in his property plan. None of these actions were dangerous in isolation, but they signaled consensus, a forming collective belief that his presence was unwanted, that his silence was guilt, and his precision was arrogance. It was the old playbook of social exclusion, just modernized with regulatory theater. But the real attack came not through paper or gossip, but through infrastructure. One evening, Riley noticed a change in the cadence of his exterior system's heartbeat. A slight delay in sensor response, a fraction of a second lag that shouldn't have existed. He ran a diagnostic and found a data packet injection, a looping command sequence introduced to his mesh network through a peripheral node. It wasn't random. It was inserted deliberately, coded to appear as environmental feedback. The purpose wasn't to steal data or trigger an alarm. It was to degrade function, to introduce inconsistencies that would render his system unreliable over time. Someone had attempted to create doubt not through direct sabotage, but through interference so minor it could be dismissed as hardware fatigue. But Riley wasn't the kind of user who ignored anomalies. He traced the source to a shared frequency channel, one commonly used by commercial-grade smart meters, devices often contracted out by utility partners. He contacted the manufacturer with technical evidence and demanded a log trace. The reply he received was vague, full of liability disclaimers, but the metadata told the truth. The injection point had originated within the range of a regional contractor's mobile relay. The access used a rotating MAC address registered to an energy consultancy group linked to the same network Derek had flagged weeks earlier. Riley now had correlation. The same group tied to insurance laundering was operating within his region, pushing into residential areas through green partnerships, and deploying low-grade cyber tactics to nudge smart homes into error states. And they were using the community's own fear as camouflage. He compiled the data, filed a report through a security liaison who handled white-collar utility fraud, and encrypted the evidence in a private vault with time-release disclosure settings. Then he hardened his system, air-gapped his core nodes, implemented burst decoy feeds, and segmented every diagnostic channel into separate routers. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't even log the full changes in local storage. He made himself unreadable. Days later, the retaliation arrived. A group of contractors arrived on his street claiming to be conducting routine soil testing as part of an environmental runoff program. Their paperwork looked legitimate at first glance, but Riley requested ID verification and a call-in confirmation to the agency listed on their vehicle. The office had no record of field agents deployed to his area. He asked the men to leave. They didn't argue. They packed up, silent and expressionless, and drove off without another word. Riley documented their vehicle, recorded their faces, and flagged the license plates to his private security network. 3 of them matched an old report Derek had sent him, names used as operational staff on similar property investigations in Nevada. He now understood that Karen was only one layer. Behind her were people who operated in legal shadows, using neighborhoods as testing grounds, residents as sensors, and property lines as barriers to mask entry points. The campaign against him was no longer cultural. It was tactical. They weren't trying to drive him out of the neighborhood. They were trying to neutralize the value of his knowledge, his network, and his control. The Tesla had been a symbol, yes, but now they wanted to disarm his position, isolate him, and make him inert before he could trace the full network. So, Riley changed tactics. He didn't fight them with exposure. He fought them with density. He began upgrading his home with redundancies that looked like excess but were functionally integrated for data shielding. He added a false inverter system visible from the side path, designed to mislead observers into thinking it was his primary node. He installed a public-facing interface labeled Test Unit that appeared flawed and unstable, complete with irregular light patterns and purposely delayed responses. He seeded his own false profile into the narrative, let them chase a phantom while he operated below threshold. And then, quietly, he initiated a legal filing, one that challenged the validity of the environmental oversight claims made by the consultancy group. Not from himself, but through a nonprofit tied to a research partner he once helped fund. The case would take months. It would be dismissed and resubmitted, but the data burden would shift. He didn't inform the community. He didn't notify Karen. He let the lights dim a little longer on his porch. Let the mail pile up once. Skipped a walk. Played the role of the man under pressure. The man wearing down. He knew what they wanted to see, and he gave them just enough of it. What they didn't know was that he wasn't losing. He was waiting. The line between containment and confrontation dissolved the moment they crossed into his threshold. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically. Feet on gravel that did not belong to them. Hands reaching toward junctions that were not theirs to touch. Up until then, the operation against Riley had existed in the margins. Ambiguous notices, engineered malfunctions, procedural obstructions, whispers turned into paperwork. They had relied on ambiguity, on plausible deniability, on the assumption that no single push would be enough to provoke a decisive response. But people who deal in subversion often miscalculate the quiet ones. They mistake restraint for weakness, patience for fear, and structure for submission. What they didn't realize was that Riley hadn't endured their campaign out of hesitation. He had simply been calculating the point of absolute certainty, when the line they crossed would no longer require interpretation. That moment came when 3 individuals entered his property in uniform, under the pretext of utility equipment recalibration. They wore badges that mimicked state insignia, carried clipboards, and spoke in tones rehearsed for recorded environments. But their names didn't check out with the utility office, and their credentials, when scanned, returned blank metadata tags. They weren't there to inspect anything. They were there to install something. Riley didn't confront them. He didn't shout, threaten, or film. He let them walk the length of the property, followed their steps from a distance, logged every movement through layered sensors embedded in the perimeter stone, and flagged each device they touched or examined. Then he waited until they approached the rear panel, his decoy system, the one he'd intentionally configured to look like the source of network instability. That's where they attempted to connect their diagnostic unit. It didn't work. The port was live, but the firmware was a dummy build, designed to reject foreign protocols while appearing glitchy. They tried again, then left, marking something in their notes. They didn't install anything, not visibly, but when Riley reviewed the packet scans later that evening, he found a spike in outbound signal traffic, a burst upload directed at an anonymized collection point. They had come not to interfere, but to extract. That meant everything up to that point had been reconnaissance. The real operation had just begun. He didn't contact the authorities. He contacted a data escalation specialist, a contractor in Oregon who handled cyber forensic overlays for infrastructure sabotage cases. She built a module to isolate the fingerprint of the spike's origin protocol, and within 12 hours she had mapped it to a digital spine used by a private logistics firm known for supplying modular analytics to third-party insurers. That same firm had submitted regional energy disruption assessments in 3 counties over the past 18 months, each one followed by a cluster of fire incidents or claims disputes tied to electric infrastructure. Riley now had pattern, motive, and mechanism, but he didn't release it. Instead, he went local. He compiled a short file, succinct, verified, and tailored for impact. He submitted it to the regional utility board through a channel used for independent whistleblower reports. He included timestamps, unauthorized signal penetrations, MAC address matches, and 3 supporting expert declarations from contacts in his network. He didn't ask for intervention. He asked for record locking, a freeze on all claim adjustments or infrastructure modifications within a 3-block radius, pending internal review. Legally, it triggered a compliance flag. Operationally, it stalled whatever the external agents were trying to do. And as expected, the moment that stall went into effect, the pushback went public. The next day, an unsigned letter circulated the neighborhood, distributed to every home except his. It described Riley as a disruptive energy radical, someone operating in isolation from the community whose actions have triggered legal investigations. It cited multiple failed audits, aggressive electrical conduct, and potential criminal misrepresentation of energy use. It used phrases like public risk and contamination liability. No accusations were formal. No sources were cited. But the tone was unmistakable. It was a call to isolate, to distance, to fear. And it worked. By the following afternoon, someone had left a stack of stones at his front step, an archaic symbol, primitive in its message. Stay out. Don't return. You are other. That night, Riley reviewed his internal footage and found something more troubling. One of the men from the recent inspection had returned. Alone. No vehicle, no tools. Just a short, solitary figure stepping into his yard and standing silently in front of the house for several minutes, looking directly into the camera, saying nothing. Then he walked away. There was no forced entry, no vandalism, no attempt at damage, but the message was clear: we see you. And Riley understood the counter-message he needed to send. He prepared a package. Not explosive, not malicious, informational. It contained a summary of the unauthorized entry, copies of the false credentials, a stripped-down report of the outbound signal trace, and an encrypted QR code linking to a secure mirror of the broader evidence file. He printed 6 copies and delivered them by hand, not to neighbors, not to Karen, but to members of the city's Public Integrity Office. The same office Karen had once worked with on a grant-funded neighborhood audit program. The office didn't react immediately. It didn't need to. Riley didn't expect fireworks. He expected a record, and once that record existed, it couldn't be deleted quietly. The retaliation came within 48 hours. A fire not on his property this time, but behind the residential maintenance shed near the park. Small, contained, but strategically placed, close enough to create panic, far enough to avoid structural damage. The narrative was instant. A trend of unsafe energy behaviors. Non-compliance-induced combustion events. It was, in short, an attempt to widen the lens. If they couldn't isolate him legally, they would isolate him culturally by framing the entire neighborhood as under threat from individual actors. But it failed. The timing was too clean, the location too suspect. One resident reported seeing a figure with gloves in a small case moments before the fire started. When the fire department arrived, they found traces of synthetic accelerant, and for the first time, the narrative cracked. Riley didn't gloat. He didn't step forward. He let the crack spread. He let people ask their own questions. And behind the scenes, the compliance freeze triggered a broader review. The consultancy group connected to the fake inspectors was subpoenaed for unrelated violations. Their regional contract was suspended. The digital spine that had recorded his energy data went dark. The pressure released. Karen disappeared. Not completely. Her house remained, the lights still switched on, but she stopped appearing at community functions, stopped placing notes in mailboxes, stopped shaping narrative. Whether by legal pressure, internal collapse, or quiet withdrawal, the voice that had once controlled the flow of fear in Oak Ridge went silent. And just like that, the campaign ended. Not with a headline, not with a verdict, but with absence. There was no announcement, no formal message from the city, no apology from the residents, no final confrontation in which Riley could deliver the kind of decisive statement most people seem to crave at the end of conflict. The resolution didn't come in the form of recognition. It came in withdrawal. The machine stopped scanning. The strange data surges ceased. No more fake inspectors appeared. No more letters landed in his mailbox. Karen's porch light remained off for weeks. No packages, no visitors, no signs of activity except for an automated sprinkler system that sputtered to life twice a day, feeding her overseeded lawn in neat, symmetrical patches. The neighborhood began to exhale, cautiously like a dog who couldn't remember when the tension began, but instinctively knew it had finally loosened its grip. It wasn't a victory that anyone would point to. It was just quiet. Riley didn't revert. He didn't disassemble the systems he had built, didn't lower his safeguards or remove the redundancies he had installed. He understood the lesson too well. The threat had never been about chaos. It had been about control, dressed in policy and persuasion. And once a structure learns that it can turn people into tools and tools into surveillance, it doesn't forget, it simply adapts. So he adapted too, not out of fear, but out of realism. His house now operated like a low-visibility compound, not overtly militarized, not hostile, but dense with awareness. Layers of logic governed every subsystem, from HVAC timing patterns to lighting cycles calibrated against human observation thresholds. He didn't add more technology. He just made what he had impossible to co-opt. Even the charger was redesigned, stripped down, disguised as a manual tool shed, connected through ground-level cabling that ran beneath false irrigation lines. He replaced the Tesla, but not with the same model. Instead, he acquired a commercial fleet-grade electric van under a private LLC and registered it outside the county. It wasn't about going off-grid, it was about becoming functionally untraceable. No app connectivity, no performance feedback loops, no profile integration. The exterior was unbranded, deliberately mundane, and its presence in his driveway barely registered among the community's attention, now starved for new conflict. Neighbors looked, then looked away. There was nothing there to feed the machine anymore. He began receiving subtle nods of acknowledgement from people he'd never spoken to before. A man trimming hedges paused to offer a silent thumbs up. A teenager skating down the sidewalk slowed to wave once, then kept moving. No words, no confessions, no, "I'm sorry about before." Just a shift, they knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not how deep it had gone, but enough to feel the discomfort of having stood too close to something that could have swallowed them too, had they stood still for long enough. Karen's house went on the market a month later. The listing was quiet, off-market at first, then public after the third week. The photos were generic, the write-up sterile. Well-maintained mid-century home with modern fixtures and ideal community integration. Riley read it once, then deleted the alert. He didn't attend the open house. He didn't need to see who would come to replace her. He knew the system wouldn't vanish, only recalibrate. But at least now, the next person would arrive without the inherited authority Karen had wielded. The soil was different now, and people had started asking questions. Riley didn't become a hero. He didn't speak at town halls or create exposés or organize awareness forums. What he did was build. Quietly, consistently. He redesigned a portion of his side yard into a test grid. Not flashy, not visible from the street, but methodical in layout. A place where different solar-to-storage converters could be evaluated under real-world conditions. He shared the data with a closed circle of engineers and researchers, people who were trying to decouple residential energy systems from the corporate dependencies that had made them vulnerable in the first place. He didn't put his name on any of the papers, but he contributed to all of them. On one corner of the structure, barely visible unless someone stood within a meter of the rear fence, he engraved a small phrase into the steel mounting bracket. Control doesn't need to announce itself. Neither does resistance. No one saw it. No one needed to. It wasn't for them. In the evenings, he sat on the porch again, not because he had reclaimed it, but because it was always his to begin with. He watched the shadows move across the sidewalk. Sometimes a dog barked. Sometimes the wind shifted the trees in strange rhythms. Nothing dramatic. Just life. The kind of life that only becomes visible after silence has returned. There was still risk. The systems that came after him didn't vanish. They just changed targets, changed faces, moved through new neighborhoods with new Karen equivalents willing to lend them social cover. But they wouldn't find what they found in Oak Ridge, not in that configuration. Not again. Riley had made sure of it. And if they ever came back, they wouldn't find a man caught off guard. They'd find someone already watching.